Now, ever since the inception of any new technology, and trains included in that, there was always the discussion of, alright, that's great and all, but how can we use it to kill each other? It's just a thing that comes up in conversation casually, unfortunately, really, but it is a thing that has occurred. And as early as the American Civil War, trains were utilized by military. And it makes sense, because trains could haul a tremendous amount of weight at relatively fast speeds, especially in that era. Like, compared to what they were using back in the 1800s, horse and buggy, trains might as well have been going at light speed. They were tremendously useful. But what about armoring them, protecting them from enemy fire? Because you don't want them getting blown up, we gotta make sure they can, have some defense. And a good defense is also a great offense. So let's give them a bunch of guns, which is a thing that happened often enough to be notable. World War I saw the use of quite a number of different armored trains, and that would last well into World War II era. Now, the thing about armored trains is that, while they're cool, I think they're really cool and scary, their benefits don't actually outweigh their main weakness, which is, no matter how much armor you put on the train itself, no matter how powerful it may be, it always has to run on tracks. Always going to be a thing that it has to do, and there's really no effective way to make sure the track stays intact. They are subject to sabotage as well as bombings. It's easy to cripple a train by just making sure it can't go anywhere. World War I saw the introduction of modern tanks, and even though World War I tanks were pretty bad on their own, they did have the added benefit of being able to go pretty much wherever they wanted. And by World War II, that was definitely the case. The technology had evolved, and now the internal combustion engine, which didn't have to run on rails, could go anywhere, with armor, and a big old cannon. So armored trains started seeing a little less use over time. Their biggest benefit, however, was the fact that they could haul a lot more weight than a tank could. Even by modern standards, they could still do that if you really wanted to. And they were pretty good defensively. You couldn't use them offensively because, you'd have to take them into enemy territory, and the enemy could easily sabotage their own rail lines. And that's assuming that your enemy's country uses the same rail gauge as you do. And they sometimes didn't, so that your train couldn't run on their rails anyway. Do you see why this idea didn't really work out that great? But in the opening stages of World War II, when the UK got drawn into battle because Hitler was being a big old jerk, the vast majority of the rail companies and rolling stock in the United Kingdom actually became the property of the War Department. They were all resources to be utilized in the war effort. Now, the War Department didn't really have any notions about utilizing armored trains offensively because they knew better by that point that they just weren't going to be able to be that useful compared to the tanks they had. But the concern early on was that the UK would turn into a land war. It's pretty common knowledge that Hitler absolutely desperately wanted to invade the UK on the ground. That was a big part of his plan. Now, he never got to do this for a variety of reasons, a couple of missteps here and there, and the fact that the UK had the Royal Navy. And although the German Kriegsmarine did have a ton of U-boats, their surface ships paled in comparison when you look at what the Royal Navy had. So that pesky English Channel was the UK's saving grace. In addition to the fact that no matter how many supply ships they sunk, there were always 24 more coming over from America, keeping the UK up and running while they held off the German assault. But the War Department was still concerned that Hitler could surprise them and somehow manage to land troops on the island. And the thing about the UK that's actually quite unique is that not only do they depend heavily on their rail network, but theirs is very condensed. I mean, they don't have a lot of room to work with, so there's a lot of lines, just all over the place. The notion of utilizing armored trains under that scenario, where you're under attack and you have to defend, actually makes some logical sense. The rails are already there. You already have a bunch of rolling stock you can use for this, so they commissioned the modification of several trains into armored ones, 13 in total. The larger trains, the standard gauges, would have been using modified steel coal wagons, as well as a locomotive with armor plating on it. Their armament consisted of QF 6-pound Hotchkiss guns. They're 6-pound guns. These are nothing to mess with. They were very powerful. As well as Vickers machine guns or Lewis guns. On board they often had Bren light machine guns, Thompson submachine guns, and Lee Ifield rifles. While comparatively to a train that might have been constructed to be armored from the ground up, the modified UK versions might seem a little lackluster. The fact was, they could still do the job. and any invading army would have to deal with a train that could easily shoot back and do a ton of damage, and it wouldn't have been easy to take these things out. Trains are heavy on their own, and these are armor-plated. That was one of their biggest traits, is that they're effectively moving fortresses. But there was one train in particular that was not quite as, fortressy as the others, and that was the armored train that was owned and constructed by the Romney, Hythe, and Dymchurch Railway. Now, the RH&D Railway is a narrow-gauge railway. Narrow gauge is a blanket term. It doesn't necessarily mean something very specific. It generally refers to any gauge of rails that is smaller than the standard. That's generally all narrow gauge means. In Romney, Hythe, and Dymchurch's case, it meant that their lines ran on a 15-inch 381mm gauge. It was a light railway with small locomotives. And I mean that. Actually, let me show you this picture. This is really important to me. I can't overstate how teeny tiny these trains were. I mean, they're not like the smallest things in the world, but like compared to what you think of when you think of a locomotive, you know, a large, big, old steam engine, you know, it's like 3 times the size of you. No. These were no taller than most cars. Like, they were very small steam trains. But they were good at what they did. And the advantage to a lighter railway with smaller rolling stock is that they can often take tighter turns, as well as go up steeper grades. There's some utility in that, and you don't see narrow gauges very often, so even just as a novelty railway, it's a lot of fun to ride on one of these little things, and just stand near them. I mean, I would love to see one of these. They look great. The engine in question is actually the number 5 Hercules. She was one of 2 mountain-type locomotives manufactured by Davy Paxman, and she arrived at New Romney on the 20th of April 1927. The railway went through a rough patch in the 30s, probably owed to the Depression if I had to guess, and the Hercules actually was nearly derelict. But a boost in ballast traffic in 1936 saw a need to refurbish her, and she was put back into service. When the war rolled around, she was the locomotive that was chosen to pull the armored train. She was modified with a whole bunch of armor plating, pulling modified coaches that were all armored and ready to go, and it was all kind of adorable. I mean, let's be fair, this is like the cutest armored train you've ever seen in your friggin' life. It was small, but make no mistake, this thing could tear you up. The Hercules wasn't powerful enough to pull 6-pound Hotchkiss guns, so instead she carried 2 Boys anti-tank rifles and 4 Lewis guns. She was manned by the 6th Battalion, Somerset Light Infantry, and she managed to put in work. Germany was never able to do an actual invasion of the UK. They could only do aerial assaults with the Luftwaffe. But the thing about the Hercules is that she was equipped to deal with aircraft in particular, since she couldn't pull anything heavier for, say, anti-armor and things like that. As a result, the Hercules and her armored train are credited with shooting down a Messerschmitt Bf-109, which we've talked about being the bulk of the Luftwaffe's air force, a Heinkel HE-111, which was their main bomber, as well as a Dornier Do-17, also a bomber that was a bit older than the HE-111. But I repeat, the smallest armored train in history, literally, Guinness Book of World Records says so, shot down not 1, not 2, but 3 aircraft in the defense of the United Kingdom. And, you know, for me, personally, as a train fan, that's a win. I'm gonna be honest, it's a big win. Those fools, they underestimated her power. Before the war was over and things turned into a war in Europe, not the UK, the train, and the rest of the railway, frankly, were instrumental as part of Operation Pluto, which stands for Pipeline Under the Ocean. This is a thing I now have to explain. Long story short, they had to put a fuel pipeline underneath the English Channel to constantly keep fuel supplies heading to the invasion force in Europe. Since they couldn't count on getting the supplies themselves there, they had to make sure they had a constant flow going to the Allies from the UK itself. And the railroads were a big part of making sure that happened. It was a success. And you may be wondering, what happened to number 5 Hercules? Well, she's still around. She still runs, in fact. She's been a few overhauls in the last few decades, but she still runs regular tourist runs on her old railway. There's actually talk of rebuilding the armored train that was dismantled after the war, just as a display piece, which I'd be kind of interested in seeing what that would have looked like in real life beyond the pictures. Definitely intrigues me. It's a heck of a story. I mean, smallest armored train, you'd think, oh, it probably didn't do that well. No, it shot down 3 planes. Totally did that. Even little engines can do big things. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.